Alrighty, hello and welcome to another edition of Conservation Conversations with Birdlife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Howes-Whitecross, and I'd like to welcome all of our viewers tuning in through Zoom and Facebook Live tonight. As always, you can communicate with us through the Zoom chat room and ask your questions to our speaker throughout the webinar using the Q&A box or comment feeds on Facebook. Our speaker will answer these at the end of the webinar. You can also use the hashtag Conservation Conversations if you'd like to engage with us on social media. And if you've missed out on any of our previous webinars, you can either watch the recordings on the Birdlife South Africa YouTube channel or listen via our new podcast channel that is available on all major podcast streaming services. We'd like to say a big thank you to those of you who continue to support the production of these webinars by donating through the Quicket Donations platform. You can simply scan the QR code or visit the Conservation Conversations website to find the link on the donations website. Your contributions really do help us to keep these talks free for all to learn and enjoy. Tonight we'll be announcing September's winner at the end of the webinar, so be sure to stay tuned and find out who the lucky winner of our Jacana Media Monthly giveaway is going to be. We'd also like to say a big congratulations to Peter Radcliffe, who is the winner of this month's Zeiss hamper. Peter walks away with a wonderful hygiene kit that includes the famous Zeiss lens wipes. And I'm sure as we all move through these uncertain COVID times, Peter's going to be enjoying this wonderful hygiene pack that's full of exciting cleaning products. So thanks to Peter, who tuned into Dale's talk last week. You are the lucky winner, and congratulations to you. I'll be in touch with you tomorrow to get all of your delivery details. Tomorrow night, you can join Birdlife South Africa and I as we host the live virtual launch of the next Roberts book in partnership with Jacana Media. Professor Nolene Turner, Temba Mtembu, Sakamuzi Mhlongo, and Junior Gabela, all community bird guides trained through Birdlife South Africa, will share the journey of creating the first comprehensive guide to birds of KwaZulu-Natal and their Zulu bird names. This promises to be a fascinating evening, and you can register for the event through Birdlife South Africa's birding events page on our website, or you can drop an email to conversations@birdlife.org.za to get that registration link. Now, have you ever wanted to explore a Big Five area on two wheels and get to see the Bushveldt's birds from your bicycle? You can join the Birdlife South Africa team for our annual cycle in the Bushveld at Abelana Game Reserve from 5 to 8 November. Space is limited, so be sure that you sign up soon. The price has been reduced to just 13,000 Rand per person, and if you need any further information, please contact Hyril Naik at hyril.naik@birdlife.org.za. Now tonight we welcome Dr. Melissa Lewis to the Conservation Conversation stage. It is certainly a Melissa Squared affair tonight. Melissa is the Policy and Advocacy Programme Manager at Birdlife South Africa, where she works to bridge the conservation policy, legislation and implementation gaps. Melissa works closely with government and other BirdLife partners to ensure that overlapping international instruments for conservation are upheld. Melissa has a master's from Lewis and Clark School in the USA and a PhD in environmental law from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. She is without a doubt one of South Africa's top environmental law experts and served on the Technical Committee for the Conservation of African Eurasian Migratory Water Birds, also known as AWA, and we'll be learning a little bit more about these international treaties tonight from Melissa. Now, Melissa's joining us from the Durban area in KwaZulu-Natal, and she'll be relocating up to Johannesburg in the upcoming months. And we are really looking forward to hearing what you have to say tonight, Melissa. You're a wonderful addition to our Birdlife South Africa family. So I'm going to hand over to you. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Let me just get this screen shared. Okay. Can you see everything clearly?
All sorted. Go for it.
Great. Thanks very much. So thanks, Melissa, for that very generous introduction. Thanks to everybody else for joining us this evening. I really hope that most of you learned something new about a group of conservation instruments that I personally find really fascinating. It is a little bit daunting to know that people such as David Stroud are in line, who have far more lengthy involvement in these agreements than I have. But hopefully, David, you'll stick around for the question session afterwards to help me out a bit if I struggle with any curveballs that people throw me. Right. So even though my background is primarily in law, I've always been really fascinated by the stories associated with bird migration. So I thought that might be a good starting point for this evening's conversation. And just to look back at some of the early theories that people have used to explain the seasonal disappearance of certain species of birds along the way. So, as some of you may already be aware, some of the first serious attempts to explain bird migration were attempted all the way back in 4th century BC by Aristotle. And even though some of his observations about the movements of birds were reasonably accurate, he was also the origin of several theories that were just nothing close to correct. So one example of that would be the theory of transmutation, which essentially suggested that certain species of birds simply transform into others upon the change of seasons. So for example, redstarts becoming robins. And you can kind of understand where the thinking behind this lay when you consider, first of all, that these species are quite similar looking. Secondly, that one arrives in Greece from the north at roughly the same time as the others heading towards more southerly latitudes. You can also kind of understand where Aristotle's suggestions came from that certain species of birds simply go into hibernation during the winter, either in hollows of trees or in the case of certain species such as swallows in the mud underlying reed beds and ponds. And that myth was perpetuated for several centuries. As you can see from this drawing from the 1500s, which depicts fishermen pulling up a net filled with not only fish, but also several birds that had ostensibly been hibernating in the mud below this lake. And then moving on to the early 1700s, you find this publication, which suggested that for the winter, certain species of birds simply flew to the moon, which is obviously quite a laughable proposition at this stage. We obviously know far more about the movements of migratory birds. At this point, we know that there is no species that flies to the moon, but we also know that there are many species that travel absolutely astonishing distances to other parts of the Earth, and that in doing so, they really create a web of pretty intricate connections across the planet. And this idea of birds connecting the world is the theme of this year's World Migratory Bird Day, which is just around the corner. It's coming up in less than 2 weeks. If that feels a little bit like deja vu, it's because there are indeed 2 World Migratory Bird Days every year, which are essentially timed to be aligned with peak migration periods. And if you're not familiar with this day, it's basically a global awareness campaign. It's designed to focus attention on the importance of and the threats to migratory birds and their habitats. It's supported by a wide range of organizations, including many partners in the Birdlife Partnership, but it's really spearheaded by Environment for the Americas, and then 2 of the world's most prominent contemporary bird conservation treaties, the Convention on Migratory Species and the Agreements on the Conservation of African and Eurasian Migratory Water Birds, or AWA. And so in light of the fact that this day is just around the corner, and in light of the role of these instruments in promoting the day and in protecting our migratory birds that we know and love, while they're in other parts of the world, I thought it would be worthwhile to dedicate this conservation conversation to these instruments and the role that they play in bird conservation. Right, so I just want to acknowledge up front that in much the same way as just about any form of national environmental law is going to have some relevance or other to bird conservation, so too is there a very broad range of international instruments that contributes to bird conservation in various ways. either because they are aimed at conserving wildlife or biodiversity in general, or because they aim to conserve particular areas or ecosystems, or because they're aimed at tackling particular cross-cutting threats that pose a risk both to humans and other species. But tonight, what I'm really wanting to focus on is a very directed subset of international instruments, namely those that are explicitly dedicated to bird conservation and have that as their primary objective. And there's actually an extremely long history of these types of instruments in international law. Birds were actually one of the first groups of species to attract the attention of treaty makers well over a century ago. They've remained on the international agenda ever since. And as a result, what you've seen is the development of an incredible wealth of and variety of instruments, of international instruments for bird conservation. And as a result of that, you find that some scholars have even suggested that in much the same way as birds themselves provide phenomenal indicators of the biological health of the ecosystems of which they form a part, so too can this collection of international bird conservation instruments and their evolution and their successes and their failures serve as somewhat of an indicator for the overall health of international environmental law as a whole. Which is an idea that I really like. It's one that I'll swing back to towards the end of the presentation. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit about this species over here, this WhiteStalk. This is actually one of my favorite migrants. That wasn't always the case. It's a species that really grew on me while I was living in Europe. I think partially because I think it's just so emblematic of humans and wildlife living side by side. So this is actually a photograph that I took on my very first day living in the Netherlands of a WhiteStalk nesting on someone's chimney. This is another photograph that I took in The Hague. So if you've ever visited The Hague, you may be aware that historically the WhiteStalk was the city's historic heraldic symbol. And so if you visit, keep a lookout for them. There are emblems of them literally on every corner. And I really like this one because it depicts the WhiteStalk catching a snake, which was one of the reasons for which the species was considered to be particularly valuable to humans historically, which again is a theme that I'll touch on again in a few minutes. It was also while I was abroad that I learned the story of this particular WhiteStalk. So this animal is currently housed at the University of Rostock in Germany. As you can see, it was impaled by a spear while in its African wintering grounds. It survived the injury. In fact, it survived the entire return flight to Europe with the spear embedded in its neck. Upon arriving in Europe, it was shot on an estate in Germany and this time killed. And all of this happened almost 200 years ago in 1822. And at the time, the stork was apparently celebrated for providing the first tangible proof that this species migrates as far as equatorial Africa during the European winter. And I really like that story because apart from being just a fascinating piece of the history of our understanding of bird migration, I think it also really illustrates in a very concrete way the manner in which these species connect not only different countries, but different continents, vastly different cultures, and of course the types of threats that they face in doing so. Now, thankfully, with improvements in technology, migratory birds are able to carry far less harmful man-made implements nowadays to tell us about their journey. So this is a screenshot that I took from an app called Animal Tracker, which allows you to track individual WhiteStalks and other species that have been fitted with tracking devices. And obviously this type of data also allows us to produce far more detailed maps of species and far more accurate maps of species migration routes. And what I really like about both of these types of maps is that they give a very clear illustration of just how many countries can be connected by individual animals and individual species. But therein obviously lies a challenge, because in addition to the fact that the landscapes that these species are traversing are often physically fragmented, they're also fragmented in the jurisdictional sense, right? Migratory birds don't respect the arbitrary lines that we humans like to draw in maps. Many of them are not confined by border walls, no matter how much some politicians like them. And as a result, they pass through the successive jurisdictions of multiple states, the laws and policies of which may differ considerably. And those differences in and of themselves are not necessarily problematic. It isn't essential that each and every state take an identical approach to conservation. But what is essential is that states coordinate their actions in order to ensure that they conserve networks of suitable habitats throughout species ranges, and then also in order to ensure that the cumulative impacts of threats, such as hunting and other unnecessary causes of mortality, are not unsustainable. And this is where international instruments come in. As platforms which promote and facilitate this type of coordination and cooperation, not only between states themselves, but also between states and a wide variety of other stakeholders. And that's what I really see the key value of these instruments as being. Now, as I mentioned, there's a very long history of international law concerning bird conservation. I'm not going to give an exhaustive exposition of that, but I do think that it's worth giving some consideration to where we've come from in order to illustrate that even though the international conservation community still faces an absolute mountain of seemingly ever-growing challenges, we have actually come a long way when it comes to the design and functioning of these instruments and the contributions that they make to conservation. So I just want to start by looking back at the first ever multilateral bird conservation treaty, which was the 1902 Convention for the Protection of Birds Useful for Agriculture. Now, a myriad of criticisms can be made of this convention. One of the most common is that it drew a strict distinction between species of birds such as the WhiteStalk that were considered to be useful to humans and therefore deserving of protection. And then on the other hand, species that were noxious and therefore explicitly excluded from protection, with the idea being that they could be actively eradicated. And that list of noxious species is pretty shocking by modern standards. It included mostly water birds and various birds of prey. It was obviously highly problematic insofar as it didn't consider the important roles that these species play in their ecosystems. It didn't give a basic level of protection to all indigenous species. But that wasn't the only shortcoming of the treaty, because even to the extent that it attempted to protect certain species, it didn't provide a very strong framework for doing so. And there were a number of reasons for that. One was its geographic coverage, which didn't extend beyond Europe, and so didn't include all of the range states of these species. The second problem was just with the text itself. The provisions were very weakly drafted. They, by and large, only aimed to address one threat to these species, namely hunting. And they also weren't designed to evolve over time. They couldn't be easily amended in order to address new and emerging threats and changes in information. And then finally, and very importantly, the treaty didn't make any provision for institutions to monitor and support implementation. And so as a result, it became what's being referred to as a sleeping treaty. It existed on paper, but it had very little impact on state behavior in practice. So the question then is, well, how have things progressed since then? And I'll start by saying that although our understanding of migratory birds' flyways has gradually improved over time. The international community has really struggled to translate that idea of a flyway into an effective legal framework. And so what you found for decades was that multilateral bird conservation efforts tended to focus exclusively on Europe. And in other regions, the legal instruments of choice tended to be bilateral treaties between only two parties. And I don't want to suggest that those were not important developments and that they haven't made an important contribution to bird conservation. They were important, they have made a meaningful contribution. If one looks, for instance, at the very first of the bilateral migratory bird treaties, the 1916 convention between the United States and Britain on behalf of Canada, that treaty is still in force. It provided the basis that allowed the United States federal government to adopt the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is also still in force, which has made an incredibly important contribution to bird conservation in North America over the past century. So these instruments have been important, but the point really is that despite their significance, bilateral solutions that only involve two states really are not ideal for addressing conservation problems that can only be addressed through the cooperation of multiple states. And so in recognition of that, in 1979, states adopted the Convention on Migratory Species. Now, I'm sure many of you have at least heard of this convention. You might not be aware of how exactly it functions. You may at least have heard that it does list endangered migratory species and prescribe certain conservation measures in respect of those species. So that's the first thing it does. And I should highlight in this respect that the treaty, or the parties to the treaty, have employed a very broad interpretation of what constitutes a migratory species for the purposes of the convention. Essentially, if a significant proportion of a population, of a species population, engages in transboundary movements, then that population can be considered to be migratory for the purposes of the convention, even if those transboundary movements are not seasonal migrations as such. And that has been quite a controversial point in recent years, not so much in the context of bird conservation, but in the context of certain commercially valuable megafauna. And I'd certainly be happy to discuss that in more detail a little bit later if you're interested in it. But for our purposes right now, I'd like to focus more on the second role of the Convention on Migratory Species, which is to promote the development of more directed ancillary agreements for specific species or specific groups of species. And these can take a wide variety of forms. So if we're looking just at the bird conservation context, you've got the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, or AWA, and the Agreements on the Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels, or ACAP, both of which are legally binding treaties in their own rights. Then when it comes to African Eurasian migratory raptors, you've got the Raptors Memorandum of Understanding, which is non-binding. And when it comes to African Eurasian migratory land birds, you've got a non-binding action plan that's been adopted under the Convention on Migratory Species. So a wide range of types of agreements. I'm not going to go into all of those in detail. To do so would take the entire evening. I'm going to focus instead primarily on AWA, not only because this is the agreement in respect of which I have had the most direct involvement, but also because it really is the most advanced of these four instruments. It's the oldest, it has the most intricate legal text, it has the most advanced institutional structures, and it really has been a pioneer within the CMS family in several respects. And so I think it provides a really useful instrument to illustrate the types of advances that we've seen over time since those early efforts at international bird in respect of international bird conservation. Okay, so just to start by giving you a bit of an introduction to this agreement, it covers the geographic scope that you can see in the map. That includes 119 range states. 80 of those countries are parties to the treaty, as is the European Union, that's the 81st party. It covers 255 species of water birds, so species that are ecologically dependent on wetlands for at least part of their annual cycle. And its central objective is to maintain these species at or restore them to a favorable conservation status. And that really is the central objective of any of the agreements that are adopted under the context of under the framework of the Convention on Migratory Species. So how does this agreement differ from the instruments that had preceded it? Well, there are a number of key differences. I'm going to start by talking about its institutional structure, or its key institutions, because as I've already suggested, without those, all you have is something that may look very nice on paper, but is really just a sleeping treaty. And so to begin with, AWA's key decision-making body, and indeed the key decision-making body for any contemporary environmental treaty, is going to be a meeting of the parties, a MOP, or a conference of the parties, a COP. And as that name suggests, what this is a meeting of representatives of the governments of all the states that are parties to the treaty. And that body is mandated to make amendments to the treaty, to adopt interpretations of its provisions, to adopt guidance on its application, and indeed in the AWA context, you've seen the MOP adopting a massive wealth of guidance on various aspects of water bird conservation. While we're talking about the MOP, one thing that I do want to highlight is that under AWA in recent years, there has been a very strong emphasis on attempting to improve implementation in Africa, and in attempting to enhance African states' engagement with the treaty. And one of the ways in which that is supported is through the arrangements of African PreMops. So these are basically meetings that occur before each MOP. They're attended by all African national focal points, and they provide an opportunity for African parties to familiarize themselves with the documentation that's going to be presented at a MOP, to coordinate their positions on that documentation to the extent that they wish to do so, and to engage in various capacity building activities. And I hope that you can appreciate the significance of that if you consider the map of the agreement area that I showed you on the last slide. And if you consider that the geographic area that is covered by the agreement is pretty much predominated by Europe and Africa. And in Europe, you've got the EU, which is a phenomenally strong negotiating bloc. And if you want to have a counterbalance to that, so that the agreement isn't completely dominated by European interests and European perspective, then Africa needs to be able to present a united front. And there are definitely examples in recent years in which it has done that very effectively, to the benefits of the agreement, I would say. And having these African PreMops does facilitate that by fostering camaraderie amongst African national focal points, and by providing capacity building opportunities. And just to comment on those photographs, those were from the last African PreMop, which was held in Eswatini. I'm sure many of you recognize the lovely lady on the top, Pumbu Mafumo, who is South Africa's national focal point. And in that picture, she is chatting to national focal points from Kenya, Ghana, and Uganda. And those four are really quite a formidable quartet within the Africa group. There are strong voices within that context, which is nice to see South Africa playing a strong role in that regard. Now, meetings of the parties under AWA only occur every 3 years. which obviously isn't sufficient to keep a treaty moving from day to day, so they need to be subsidiary bodies. And so any contemporary conservation treaty, pretty much most of them at least, will have some kind of scientific advisory body. In the AWA context, this takes the form of the Technical Committee. So this is where my primary involvement with AWA has been as a member of the Technical Committee. And this is basically a collection of experts from different regions and disciplines who are tasked mainly with producing a lot of the documentation that is presented to each MOP for consideration and adoption. So for example, when I was on the Technical Committee, my work ranged from developing guidelines on national laws for implementing AWA to developing guidelines on the interpretation of certain aspects of the legal text to drafting actual amendments to the legal text. I think probably the strongest of which was the addition of a new conservation category to the treaty to address near-threatened species on the IUCN Red List, which had not previously been explicitly included. And that was a proposal that was supported strongly by BirdLife International, and it went through, and we were really pleased with that. Then you've got the Standing Committee, which is a more political body. It's responsible for making political and administrative decisions between MOPs. So for example, certain decisions about budgets or whether to open compliance queries against certain states, which I'll touch on a bit later. And then really the engine of any treaty is its secretariat. Its secretariat is a permanent body. It provides not only administrative support, but also implementation support. And really a treaty is only as strong as its secretariat. AWA was very fortunate to have a very enthusiastic and committed secretariat, although as you can see, not a very large secretariat considering how big an agreements area it needs to service. Now the question you might be asking yourself is, well, what role do non-governmental stakeholders play in these processes? And the answer, at least in the AWA context, is a pretty big one. So AWA is a treaty that has exceptionally strong NGO engagement. And that's largely because right from the very beginning, in the agreement's legal text, 3 NGO seats are reserved on the Technical Committee. So the IUCN, Wetlands International, and the International Council for Game and Wildlife Conservation all have permanent seats on the Technical Committee as full members, which is really quite amazing in the context of a treaty. It's not something that you see very often. Having seats as full members reserved for NGOs. Additional NGOs then sit on both the Technical Committee and AWA's various bodies as observers. And don't let the term observer fool you. They often have a very significant impact behind the scenes and make really substantial contributions to the work of a treaty. And that's certainly been my kind of observation, having been involved in the treaty, primarily as a Technical Committee member rather than an observer, but having worked with many observers, including those on BirdLife International. So the point really is that even though agreements such as AWA are essentially agreements between states, they are only directly binding upon states, this instrument is designed to be inclusive and transparent. And this has really assisted it in being, well, rather than a sleeping treaty, a really dynamic community. And that kind of inclusiveness is important because it fosters trust building among stakeholders. It can really help to depolarize positions on controversial aspects, on controversial topics such as hunting. And it can also really foster the promotion of close partnerships between a range of different stakeholders, from the treaty secretariat to governments, to experts and NGOs. And that kind of collegiality and that kind of sense of community is not only fostered through formal settings, but also in the margin of meetings, on field trips, over pizzas and beers at the end of the day. I'm sure many of you will have noticed that there are a lot of binoculars in this picture. This was actually on a technical committee field trip to Lake Nakuru in Kenya. That was obviously a posed picture, but I really like this picture, which was from John O'Sullivan, who's a previous Birdlife representative for AOA. And what I like about this picture is that it shows representatives of 3 NGOs, 2 governments, and the AOA Secretariat, all attempting to recover from a flight from Europe to Madagascar. And even though I'm showing the picture partially in jest, I also want to give a sense of the type of relaxed ambiance that you really do find in the margins of some of these meetings, and that really does create a climate for genuine trust building and partnerships and innovations. And incidentally, David Stroud is in that picture as well. So yeah, David, I'm sure you've got many behind the scenes stories from that trip. Unfortunately, I was not yet involved with AOA for the Madagascar MOP. Okay, now that deals with the institutions. As a lawyer, it would be remiss of me not to make some comments about the technicalities of AOA's legal text. I promise you I'm only going to include one slide on this, so if it's not what blows your hair back, please just stick with me for a few minutes, and then I will move on to some more interesting points. But I do want to make a few points about how the content of this instrument and the manner in which its legal text is designed differs from those that had preceded it. And the first way is that if you look at this agreement's legal provisions, they are extremely detailed, extremely nuanced. They attempt to address the full range of threats facing migratory water birds, not only one threat, such as that 1902 convention that just focused on hunting. Also, many of these obligations are actually applicable not at the species level, but at the level of biogeographic populations. So in other words, it is possible for different legal obligations to attach to different populations of the same species if they have a different conservation status. And the treaty has quite a complex table of population categorizations, and then legal obligations are attached depending on which category a population fits into. The second major point is that both these legal obligations and the population categorizations that I mentioned are designed to evolve over time, unlike that 1902 treaty that I started the discussion with. And the way in which this is achieved in the AOA context is by structuring the legal agreement as a central agreement text, which includes several rigid but broadly framed conservation obligations, and then having a collection of annexes which are far easier to amend than the agreement text, and which are occasionally amended. And so as a result, changes have been made to AOA's legal text over time. So for example, back in 2008, various species of seabirds were added to the agreement's coverage. And so at the same time, additional legal obligations were added to the text to require parties to address various threats in the marine environment that were facing these seabirds. In terms of the actual population categorizations, these are assessed and adjusted at every single MOP. And that is done on the basis of a conservation status report, which is produced every 3 years. And the treaty actually requires that it be produced every 3 years. And there are two things that I want to highlight about that conservation status report. The first is the role of civil society and NGOs in its production. So the report's production is outsourced to Wetlands International. So it's Wetlands International that spearheads its drafting. But they draw from a wide variety of information sources, including, for instance, the International Waterbird Census, the Red List assessments that are undertaken by BirdLife International in the context of Southern African species. Some information is even drawn from SADC too. So the point is that even though the actual decisions about amendments to population categorizations are made by states as the parties to the treaty, the decisions are made on the basis of information which is largely provided by the NGO community and by civil society. The second thing that I want to highlight about the system, where you have the conservation status report being produced every 3 years and then population categorizations being adjusted on the basis of that, is that it really does allow the agreement to be very responsive to new information about population status. It allows relatively rapid adjustments to the agreement's conservation priorities to be made according to waterbird population trends. And in essence, what it really does is allow for populations' legal status to remain reasonably well aligned with their conservation status, rather than having a situation in which certain populations are either underprotected or overprotected, both of which can be problematic for various reasons. So in the AWA context, really, though, the challenge is trying to ensure that national protected species lists remain well aligned with these international lists. And I'm happy to be candid about the fact that this is not an area in which South Africa is doing especially well at all. We aren't alone in that, but if you're familiar with South Africa's threatened or protected species lists, you'll probably be aware that those are not regularly amended. They certainly aren't amended after every AWA meeting of the parties. And I really hope that that is something that can be changed in the future. At the moment, the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries is drafting substantial amendments to the Biodiversity Act, and I really hope that this is an issue that is given some consideration in those amendments. If it isn't, it's certainly a matter that we'll be submitting comments on when those amendments are released or are published for public comments. Okay, so moving away now from the agreement's legal technicalities and to what I really consider to be the hallmark of AWA, which is its commitment to the Flyway Approach. And by the Flyway Approach, I mean an approach that takes into account the threats throughout a species migration route and promotes cooperation between states in addressing those. And AWA's legal text is very clear in its commitment to the Flyway Approach and requires this both in respect of habitat conservation and the actual conservation and management of waterbird populations themselves. But it's all well and good to say that the treaty text says that. How does it translate into the treaty's actions and the activities that occur under the treaty? And I'd like to give a few examples of that. And so the first example is actually, well, now quite an old project. It was finished 10 years ago, but I thought I'd highlight it because firstly, it has subsequently been built upon, and secondly, it provides a really nice example of the manner in which treaty bodies and international NGOs can collaborate in successful flyway conservation efforts. So this was the Wings Over Wetlands project. It was a collaboration between a variety of partners, including the AWA Secretariat and BirdLife International. And there were a number of key outputs that arose from this project. The first really important output was a critical site network tool, which is a web-based tool. You can find it online. It contains a wealth of information about AWA species, about their migration routes, about the sites that are critical for their survival. So it's supposed to be a tool that can assist decision makers in their implementation of both AWA and the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. And I should also highlight that even though this tool was produced back in 2010, launched back then, it has since undergone some updates, and at present, a process is actually currently underway to produce current lists of what are being referred to as Flyway network sites, which are essentially sites in each party that are either internationally or nationally important for AWIS species. And once all of this information is collected, it is going to be loaded into the critical site network tool, and the tool will be updated. And so hopefully we'll see that occurring in the course of next year. Then another important output from this project was the production of tailor-made training materials on topics related to flyway conservation and wetland management and migratory waterbird conservation. And this is also available online. It includes a lot of really useful examples and exercises and even PowerPoint presentations. I've used it as both a learning tool and a teaching tool. And after its production, the AWIS Secretariat did actually arrange several sub-regional training of trainers workshops in various African sub-regions in order to promote its use in Africa in particular. And then finally, this project also involved a number of demonstration projects in different countries, basically aimed at showing good practice in habitat management, community engagement, ecotourism, awareness raising, etc. And I'm sure at least some of you recognize there in the picture that I've posted there. I took that from the wings of a wetlands hide in Wackerstrom, which was one of the demonstration sites. It's a beautiful part of the country. If you've never visited, I highly suggest that you give it a visit and pop into our education center while you're there. All right. Another example of the Flyway approach in practice is a lot more recent than the WOW project. And this involves recent attempts under AWA to manage huntable populations of migratory birds at the international level in order to attempt to ensure that the cumulative impacts of hunting are not unsustainable. And the first attempts at this have been made in Europe in respect to certain goose populations. It's a pretty complicated endeavor, but just in a nutshell, what it involves is range states meeting annually and agreeing on the closures of hunting seasons where appropriate, and otherwise, where appropriate, agreeing on international hunting quotas and how those are to be divided between states. And those decisions are made on the basis of population modeling that is provided by a data center, which is based at Aarhus University in Denmark. Now, I should point out that this approach has been used both to promote the recovery of populations with an unfavorable conservation status by providing for season closures and very restricted quotas that allow population recovery. But then on the other hand, it has also been used for the management of abundant populations that present conflicts with certain human interests, such as agriculture and air safety. And the latter approach has been somewhat controversial, mainly because it has partially involved attempts to deliberately reduce and then stabilize populations or population numbers through the optimization of hunting, so deliberate population management. And so you may ask, well, how does that differ from that 1902 convention's approach of treating certain species as noxious? And the answer is that the fundamental difference is that under AWA, the starting point of any management measures has to be maintenance of favorable conservation status. That is absolutely non-negotiable. any attempt to eradicate a species from even part of its range would be a very, very clear contravention of the agreement. So there is a very fundamental difference there in terms of actual basic protection that is provided for any indigenous species covered by the agreement. And I'm certainly happy to talk about that in more detail later. It is a topic about which much can be said, and on which there are a wide variety of different perspectives. So I'm happy to take any questions on that after the talk. Now, these attempts at internationally coordinated harvest management have occurred within the framework of international species action plans and international species management plans. In South Africa, and at least the African region in general, there have not yet been similar attempts to coordinate harvest management internationally, but there are various international species action plans that are relevant for the region. And these plans and the working groups that support their implementation are really important for bringing relevant actors together from throughout the species range and providing a basis for national actions. They've also ended up being really effective mechanisms for harnessing the capacity of NGOs to work with parties and other stakeholders. So, for example, international species action plans are often prepared by NGOs on the basis of input from international workshops, or intergovernmental workshops rather. So as an example, the AWA International Multi-Species Action Plan for the Benguela coastal seabirds was largely drafted by Christina Hagen from Birdlife South Africa's very own Seabird Conservation Programme. And Christina presented this document at the MOP. It's actually the only time I've ever met her in person, was in Germany when she was presenting this document, which was then adopted by the meeting of the parties. And apart from that role in spearheading the drafting of these documents, the coordinators of international species working groups that support these plans are often also NGO based. So again, in the context of the Benguela MSAP, Birdlife South Africa has a memorandum of understanding with the AWA Secretariat, in terms of which we agree to provide a coordinator for the working group. So that is going to be Tegan Carpenter-Kling from our Seabird Conservation Program. And she's currently working with the AWA Secretariat to plan a meeting of the International Working Group for early next year. Many of you will also be aware that we have a similar arrangement in respect of the International Species Working Group for the white-winged flufftail. So Birdlife South Africa does coordinate that working group as well. And that working group and work on that plan in general has really played a phenomenal role in promoting partnerships between Birdlife South Africa and a range of other governmental and non-governmental stakeholders. So we collaborate very closely with the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries on this. And in recent months, actually, the department has also been very supportive and active in attempting to engage other national departments whose decision-making has significant implications for the species. So the Department of Water and Sanitation and the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And so we're enormously grateful to DEF for that. Okay, now for the question that I'm sure has been on many of your minds since early in this presentation, which is what happens when states don't comply with their international commitments under AWA and other instruments? Now, when it comes to international conservation treaties, more and more of these treaties are creating what are generally referred to as implementation mechanisms or compliance mechanisms, basically processes to deal with allegations of non-compliance by states. Now, in the context of conservation treaties, usually these mechanisms are largely facilitative in nature, so they attempt to assist states in achieving compliance rather than being heavily coercive or punitive. In fact, the only conservation treaty compliance mechanism that I can think of that is especially punitive is that for CITES, because that is essentially a trade treaty, and so they can recommend trade sanctions. That just isn't really an option that's feasible in respect of other conservation treaties. So the measures tend to be largely facilitative. Now, the very first implementation mechanism adopted within the CMS family, so the family of agreements that have been developed under the Convention on Migratory Species, was introduced by AWA. It's called the Implementation Review Process. Since then, the Convention on Migratory Species has itself developed a similar process. And how these work is basically that the party in question is engaged on the matter. If need be, an advisory mission is sent to investigate the allegation of non-compliance, and then recommendations are produced, and the state is strongly urged to adopt those recommendations and implement those recommendations. And something I want to highlight about these particular processes, both under AWA and under the CMS, is that non-compliance allegations can be submitted by NGOs. In fact, invariably they are submitted by NGOs because states are very reluctant to submit cases against one another. So, for example, the very first AWA implementation review case concerned the critically endangered sociable lapwing and the illegal hunting of this species in Syria. There was an advisory mission that went to Syria. Recommendations were produced. This case had been submitted by BirdLife International's Middle Eastern office, and after recommendations were produced, BirdLife International actually provided a grant to assist with implementation of the recommendations. Unfortunately, this all happened shortly before the political upheaval in Syria, and unfortunately, because of the conflict that is still ongoing in that part of the world, reports on the continued implementation of those recommendations have not been forthcoming. But a more and I do apologize, I've got a cat meowing in the background. It's one of the detriments of Zoom presentations, I suppose. But far more positive news has recently come from another AWA implementation review case, the first case that has been closed under the agreement. And this case involved the United Kingdom's regulation of the hunting of the Greenland white-fronted goose. So this is a subspecies that the UK is required the UK is required to prohibit hunting under the agreement. It had not done so. An implementation review case was opened, and as a result, legislation was amended. So that provides an example that despite the fact that these processes are not especially coercive in nature, they can be effective in influencing state action and result in ultimate compliance with the agreements. Okay. Now, when it comes to the role of NGOs in supporting national implementation, so supporting their governments in implementing these treaties, if you've been following these webinars, you will already have seen many examples of this from BirdLife South Africa. And if you haven't watched some of these webinars, I'd highly encourage you to go back and watch the recordings. But in addition to those, I just wanted to highlight that BirdLife South Africa does have a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. And that memorandum of understanding does explicitly recognize the regional and global dimensions of conservation. And in that MOU, BirdLife South Africa has explicitly agreed to support the department in its implementation of international conservation instruments, such as AWA and the Convention on Migratory Species. And there's a wide variety of ways in which we do that. For example, we do provide input for the reports that the South African government is required to submit to these treaties, which provide overviews of their implementation efforts to each meeting and conference of the parties. Another recent or current example, seeing as we've been discussing AWA, is that the current AWA Plan of Action for Africa calls upon African states to develop national AWA implementation plans. And the South African government has recently embarked on a process to do this. And so we have been providing assistance in that regard, and we've recently been engaging with government to explore ways in which BirdLife South Africa may perhaps play a stronger role in supporting the development of that plan. And I should highlight that if we are successful in developing this national AWA implementation plan, it would be the first example of such a plan in the Flyway. So it would provide, or would hopefully provide, quite a useful example from which other parties could also draw. Okay, also just to highlight that BirdLife South Africa's work does not only focus on supporting South Africa's national implementation of its international commitments. We do also have a focus on supporting enhanced implementation of international conservation agreements in other African countries. So if you've been following these webinars, you'll be aware that we have a regional conservation program. Our policy and advocacy program also has a regional dimension insofar as part of my work involves providing policy and advocacy support to partners in other African countries. But one project in particular that I want to highlight tonight is the East Atlantic Flyway Initiative. So the East Atlantic Flyway is shown, it's designated on that map. It's an area that obviously includes numerous stopover sites for birds migrating from Europe to Southern Africa. Many of those sites are really threatened by a variety of human actions. And in response to this, the Birdlife Partnership has developed this East Atlantic Flyway Initiative to attempt to enhance the monitoring and conservation of these sites and the species that make use of them. And so with the support of RSPB, BirdLife South Africa recently hired Bronwyn Murray as our East Atlantic Flyway Initiative Project Manager. So she's going to be focusing on providing support to partners in Southern African countries in particular, in the context of the East Atlantic Flyway Initiative. And the thing that I want to highlight about her project is that it does include aspects that are explicitly focused on enhancing implementation of international agreements in these other Southern African countries, including by supporting their reporting, sharing information, and building capacity. And so this is a project that is still in its infancy, but Bronwyn and I have already started having discussions about the policy and advocacy aspects. I imagine that somewhere along the line she will present her own webinar, providing updates on the progress in this project. So definitely watch this space. I'm sure there are going to be some interesting updates to come along the way in the coming months and coming years. Okay, and then as much as I don't like ending a presentation on a more negative note, I did think I should include just some discussion of challenges moving forward. So the challenges that are faced by these international bird conservation instruments. And some of these I've already alluded to in the course of the presentation. I mean, obviously imperfect compliance, gaps in the data that's needed to make robust conservation decisions, gaps in membership, so certain important range states just not coming to the party, and then resource constraints at a variety of levels, all the way from the secretariats that often don't have anywhere near as many resources as they'd like to provide the implementation support that they'd like to, all the way through to governments themselves, and of course also the NGOs that are attempting to assist governments. And at the beginning of the presentation, I floated the idea that bird conservation instruments, or international bird conservation instruments, can be seen as indicators of the status of international environmental law, international conservation law more broadly. And indeed, these types of challenges that we see in the bird conservation context are broadly reflective of the types of challenges that face environmental treaties in general. Although I will say that oftentimes these particular instruments find it a lot more difficult to attract attention and resources from governments than some of the heavyweights, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that is an additional challenge for these smaller instruments. In terms of on-the-ground progress, the message really is that progress is being made, but not enough. So, for example, if we look at AWA, the most recent conservation status report indicates that that the proportion of AWA populations with stable or increasing trends has gradually improved over the past few years, at least for those populations in respect of which trend data is available. We also know that where international species action plans are in place and are actually being implemented, they are having positive impacts on population trends. But we also know that many of the targets that have been set by the last AWA strategic plan were not met in full. So, as I said, progress being made, but not enough. We need enhanced action. We need enhanced ambition. And again, this is a broadly similar message to what's coming out of other treaties as well. So you may have seen a couple of weeks ago that this report was published, the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. So this is the flagship publication of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And basically what it does is assess progress towards meeting the HE biodiversity targets, which were agreed by states in 2010 as kind of the global framework and the global agenda for biodiversity conservation. And very disappointingly, the 5th edition of this publication has concluded that absolutely none of those targets have been met in full. There have been examples of progress, there have been examples of successes in respect of certain species or countries, but at a global level, none of the targets have been met. So again, progress made, but far more needs to be done. And then I just want to end by highlighting two things, mainly because they're happening tomorrow. And the first is that if you're interested in this discussion about the HE targets and the framework that is going to ultimately replace them, the Global Biodiversity Framework, you should have a look at BirdLife International's State of the World's Birds report. This most recent report is being published tomorrow. From tomorrow, it will be available on the link on the screen. So I haven't seen the report yet, but apparently this edition of the report focuses specifically on a discussion of how bird-related data, or what bird-related data rather tells us about states' progress towards meeting the various HE biodiversity targets. And then secondly, how certain successes in bird conservation can be drawn from to inform the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is going to replace the 2010 HE targets. And then also happening tomorrow is the United Nations Summit on Biodiversity, which is being convened by the President of the United Nations General Assembly at the level of heads of state and government. If you'd like to see the call for action that various organizations, including BirdLife International, has submitted to the summit. You can see that on the link on the screen. But basically, it is hoped that heads of government use this summit as an opportunity to express a very clear commitment to bold and transformative changes to curb biodiversity loss. Whether that will happen remains to be seen. I'm afraid my experience in international negotiations is that oftentimes they tend to be an exercise in diluting ambition rather than strengthening it. But I have definitely seen exceptions to that rule in some of the discussions in the AWA context, and instances in which countries have been prepared to undertake strengthened commitments. And hopefully the current pandemic and its linkages to our mistreatment of the natural world will have given at least some world leaders some pause for thought, and will influence the approach that they take in the discussions tomorrow. But yeah, that really remains to be seen. So on that note, I think I'll end things. I've probably been rambling on for way too long. And as I said, I'm happy to take any questions that there may be in the remainder of the time that we have. Thanks very much, Melissa.
Thank you, Melissa, and my goodness, what an enlightening talk. It's amazing to see all of the stuff that's going on almost in the background, as one of the comments in the chat box mentioned. So thank you for shining light on these agreements that probably do go a little bit unnoticed by Joe Public. Really, really good insights there. Now, before we delve into the questions, I hope you've got something strong next to you, Melissa. We've got some firecracker ones for you to answer. But it is time for us to announce our winner of the September Jacana Media Giveaway Competition. So I am really excited to announce that this month's winner is Ted van der Meulen. So Ted, you're going to be walking away with those two incredible titles, the Roberts Birds of Southern Africa 7th edition, as well as Warriors, Dilettantes and Businessmen. And I'll be getting in touch with you tomorrow just to arrange that delivery. So a big congratulations to you, Ted, and I hope that you'll enjoy your new books. Now, before we move on into our questions, just a reminder to everyone, as you exit, you're going to be provided with a pop-up survey. Please feel free to just answer the 5 questions that are in there. It just helps us keep tabs on what's happening with the webinars as we move forward. And next week, we are really excited to kick off our AV Tourism Month. We are going to have my regular co-host, Andrew de Block, giving you an in-depth look at what it is to be a birdwatcher. And Andrew's going to be having a few guests presenting on his talk as well, the likes of Mike Buckham and Trevor Hardiker. So be sure to tune in and have a listen to some of the exciting and entertaining birding insights that Andrew's going to be providing to us. Now, remember that you can type in your questions to the Q&A box, and those of you tuning in through Facebook are welcome to pop your questions into the comment feed. Melissa, I'm going to kick you off with one from Eleanor Mary Cadell. And she's saying that it seems NGOs are playing quite an important role in AWA, but she'd like to know a little bit more about the compositions of the members of the AWA Secretariat. Are they scientists, biologists, just general government employees? And do they have the appropriate knowledge base to sort of undertake this big, important secretariat role? And I know Sergei Doreliev has been tuning in this evening, who is the Director of Science and Science Implementation and Compliance, and it's wonderful to have Sergei with us. I can definitely attest to Sergei's passion for bird watching and his in-depth knowledge of ornithology. So if you'd like to just unpack that secretariat a little bit for us, please.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I'll say the AWA Secretariat is housed in the United Nations. So everyone who works for the AWA Secretariat needs to go through the UN recruitment process, which is a pretty rigorous process. So Sergei's units, and it's great that Sergei is online. Thanks for joining tonight, Sergei. And I will say that Sergei is one of the most informed and competent people I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with. And so certainly his unit, which focuses on implementation support, has has employees with a very strong scientific background, and who are able to provide, they need to be able to provide that type of support to parties. Obviously, other people who work in the Secretariat in more administrative roles don't need that kind of background. So the background is very much tailored to the position. But yeah, if you've ever had a look at any of those UN job adverts, yeah, they're pretty rigorous.
Absolutely. And speaking of that United Nations recruitment process, Elizabeth Null would like to know what the role of the United Nations is in terms of facilitating these multinational treaties and agreements.
So the UN often plays a role in facilitating the negotiations. But once the treaty is in place, it's an agreement between states, so it's essentially owned by the states. So some of the secretariats are housed by the UN, but that certainly isn't the case for all secretariats. So even in the context of the Convention on Migratory Species, you have the Secretariat for the CMS itself and AWA based in the UN, and then you have the Secretariat for ACAP, which is not based in the UN system and is situated in Australia, and the coordinating unit for the Raptors MOU sitting in Abu Dhabi because it's funded by the Abu Dhabi government. So, the UN definitely doesn't play a role in all of these instruments.
Thanks. Then we've got one from Greta, and she's wanting to know what your thoughts are about birds that are not covered by international instruments. In light of the current huge loss of bird species due to climate change, for example, her question is, what is the value of having birds protected by international conservation status only for threatened birds, when actually we should maybe be looking at a sort of more bird in general treaty? Are there moves to sort of protect our more common species as well?
Well, there's the distinction between more common species and species that are migratory, right? So, common species that are migratory would be protected by these instruments because the protections don't only focus on conservation status. But when it comes to birds that are endemics, for instance, they would be addressed by broader biodiversity instruments such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. But I think the thinking behind not having a bird-specific treaty that also covers endemics is that their conservation is dependent totally on the action of one state rather than multiple states who need to coordinate the action. So the whole underlying rationale behind these migratory bird treaties, or migratory species treaties in general, is to provide platforms for cooperation where cooperation is essential in order to maintain or restore conservation status.
Cool, thanks, Melissa. Villian wants to know, so the NEMBA TOPS list is still only compiled specifically with trade threats in mind for the most part. They're obviously not taking some of the other threats into account, according to her. So any birds that are not threatened by trade are not necessarily going to be listed under our NEMBA TOPS Act. Can you speak to that a little bit more? And are they you mentioned that there's a big reformation of the NEMBA Act coming. Are they going to start including other threats into that?
Well, so I can't speak too much to the current process that is being taken in relation to trade. Trade threats are primarily addressed through the CITES list, but I do take your point that the government's emphasis does seem to be on protecting species that are threatened by trade rather than a broader range of threats, and especially threats related to habitat destruction. I don't have much of an inkling of what amendments are on the table. All I've been told so far in my discussions with governments have been that there is going to be pretty much a complete overhaul of the Act. I have had some discussions with government representatives about whether there is going to be consideration of how to align NEMBA's provisions with South Africa's requirements under international treaties, because at the moment, NEMBA has a strong focus on implementing the Convention on Biological Diversity aspects of it, and its CITES regulations have a strong focus on implementing CITES, but other treaties, such as the CMS and its daughter agreements, really fall by the wayside, and our national law is not well designed to implement those. And apparently those aspects have been given some consideration. How they've been given that consideration, and how those kinds of challenges and responsibilities are going to manifest themselves in the final texts, we really just wait to see. Yeah.
For sure. Then we've got a question from Penny Abbott speaking a little bit to this as well. She's asking, if a state becomes a party to one of these treaties, does it then have to translate that into domestic legislation? And if so, and that country then doesn't, what happens? So her example is in labour legislation, where South Africa is a party to various ILO conventions, but has not yet put in place domestic legislation. What sort of level does the South African government officials, and then sorry, do you want to answer that first, and I'll do a second part of the question afterwards?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the way in which these are incorporated into domestic law, it really depends on the country in question and the constitutional system that it has, because some countries have constitutions which specify that international treaties, once ratified by the country, automatically become part of domestic law. South Africa does not have that system. In terms of our legal system, an international treaty will only have domestic application if it is actually explicitly incorporated into our national laws. So that's what needs to happen nationally. In terms of international obligations, I mean, the obligation is there in principle to amend our domestic laws in order to reflect our treaty obligations. What happens when we don't do that is another story, and it really depends on the treaty in question. And as I said, in the conservation treaty context, by and large, with the exception of CITES, the responses tend to be facilitative rather than coercive. To the extent that they're coercive, it's really a matter of kind of naming and shaming states and putting pressure on them to change their domestic laws, rather than compelling them to do so through coercive actions. And that really comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, international law is a very different beast from national law. A state cannot be bound by a treaty without its consent. It can't remain bound by a treaty without its consent. If it wants to withdraw, it can. So it's a really tricky situation how to put pressure on states to comply with their international obligations while still keeping them at the table.
Cool, yeah. So her next sort of follow-up to that was, what sort of level of South African government officials are attending the MOPS, and what sort of commitment is there locally to implement these treaties?
So usually South Africa will send a delegation of several people from the Departments of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, and from their conservation division. So it's not like you're having participation by heads of states, etc., as you do have for at least portions of the COPs of some of these bigger treaties. My impression is that when it comes to the actual national focal points and people who are directly involved with the treaty in the South African government, they are quite enthusiastic about trying to improve implementation. I mean, if they weren't, why on earth would they have embarked on a process to try and improve implementation through the development of a national labour implementation plan, for instance? But it can be really difficult for them to get the attention of other people in their ministries who have other priorities, and it's very difficult to convince them to care about birds when they have rhinos and other species to worry about.
Absolutely, and I think it's such a challenge to break down those silos within governments, never mind between governments. So yeah, it certainly they have their work cut out for them. And I see David Stroud's put a comment into the chat box saying that the most recent conservation status report showed that in regions where there was good monitoring, there was better conservation outcomes. So a really, really important finding showing just how important it is for citizen scientists to get involved in this monitoring work and work with the NGOs to help us keep track of what's going on in our countries and therefore influence our governmental decisions and give them the ammo they need to make these decisions.
If I can also just add to that, Melissa, so just going back to the question about government commitments, I wanted to just highlight that another challenge is, so first of all, it's a challenge, getting attention for instruments such as this within our environmental department, but it's quite another challenge getting other departments on board. And, unfortunately, we do have a country where, for instance, applications for environmental authorizations for mining are ridiculously handled by the departments responsible for mining, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. Whereas obviously water use licenses, etc., controlled by Department of Water and Sanitation, you have to also be able to sell them on conservation if you want to achieve the objectives of a treaty such as this. And that can be a lot easier said than done, especially when it comes to DMR.
Absolutely, yeah, and I know you have first-hand experience trying to navigate that minefield. But we've got a question here from, another question from Greta. So I don't know if you know about the king penguin that pitched up in Cape Point last year. She wants to know if there was any sort of legal protection for that species of bird or any legal instruments that could have potentially helped with protecting that bird.
I do not know. I would have to look into this. I mean, it's not, I don't think the species isn't covered by AWA. I would have to look into whether any of the instruments would be applicable to that species in particular.
For sure, obviously king penguins calling, no, all good. They call South Georgia home, not Africa usually. But we do seem to be getting the odd individual pitching up on our shores more regularly, whether that's climate change driven or what. Maybe we'll have to look at adding them into some of these conventions one day. And then the last question that I think we're going to have time for, this is a bit of a doozy, so I hope you're ready. And this is from Eileen, and she's talking about flyways. She wants to mention two places, Malta and Gozo. And obviously we know that we have huge challenges through that sort of central Mediterranean area when it comes to thousands of birds being slaughtered by hunting. And this is often not illegal hunting in some of the countries, but we're having massive, massive challenges to try and curb this behavior and protect our migratory birds in particular. What initiatives in your experience are linked to some of these secretariats that you've mentioned to try and deal with this large-scale genocide on our migratory birds?
So, I mean, we were talking about, especially countries such as Malta. So my understanding is that's mostly it's songbirds, right? It's terrestrial birds. So in that context, unfortunately, we've got the Convention on Migratory Species, which is, a convention that could be broadly used to protect those species, especially if they are listed in Appendix 1. But otherwise, there isn't a dedicated conservation treaty for terrestrial birds. There's non-binding action plan, so that makes things quite tricky. But in the Maltese context, because they are part of the EU, I think there have been measures taken by the European Commission, or perhaps even I think that there may have been a recent case by the Court of Justice of the European Union to address concerns surrounding those issues, and that certainly would be a more robust framework within which to address the matter than an international treaty.
Absolutely. Thanks, Melissa. I know that one was a bit of a tricky one. I don't see any other questions coming through, but there's lots of interesting comments for you in the chat box, which I'll send to you after tonight's webinar. But from my side, we've just hit 8:30. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you, Melissa. I certainly learned a hell of a lot. And it really was a great insight into all of these different conventions that are working to try and bring us as a global community together to do good conservation work. So thank you for bringing your expertise and sharing this amazing story with us tonight. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week for another Conservation Conversations. So from my side, good night to everyone, and thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you, Melissa.
I'll leave the webinar open with a bit of music if anybody wants to leave their comments for a couple more minutes, and we'll see you all next week, same time, same place. Keep your eyes on the skies and keep enjoying those birds. Good night to everyone.